Bonsoir à tous, Monseigneur, Monsieur le directeur du cabinet, Madame la ministre de l'Éducation nationale, Son Excellence Bernard Fautrier, chers amis de la Monaco Méditerranée Foundation. Bienvenue à cette importante conférence sur un sujet, l'Ukraine, qui nous regarde tous. Aujourd'hui, nous avons le privilège d'accueillir un éminent diplomate américain, M. Kurt Volker, qui est mondialement connu pour son engagement inébranlable en faveur de la paix et de la sécurité. Monsieur, après avoir débuté sa carrière comme analyste à la CIA, il a ensuite travaillé pour le ministère américain des Affaires étrangères. Kurt a également été directeur exécutif du McCain Institute for International Leadership et, à titre bénévole, représentant spécial des États-Unis pour l'Ukraine. Sa carrière est marquée par une profonde compréhension des dynamiques géopolitiques et un engagement en faveur de la paix dans le monde. Le thème de la conférence de ce soir, la guerre de la Russie contre l'Ukraine, ce que nous avons appris, fait partie de l'actualité qui nous intéresse et nous préoccupe. L'expérience de M. Volker nous permettra d'explorer les ramifications de ce conflit, la résilience des nations et l'esprit indomptable de ceux qui cherchent à défendre la souveraineté et la dignité humaine. Veuillez vous joindre à moi pour accueillir chaleureusement M. Volker. Dear Kurt, it's a great pleasure that I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. The mic, yes, there we go. Thank you very, very much. Je voudrais vraiment remercier la Fondation, Madame, Monsieur Bragiotti. C'est un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici dans la présence de Prince Albert aussi. Merci d'être venu. I'm going to speak in English, so you don't have to worry anymore that I'm going to have a terrible speech in French. I will speak in English. I just, again, want to say thank you. I grew up outside of Philadelphia in the United States, and so I've always had a special place for Monaco in my heart, thanks to Princess Grace and her history in Philadelphia. And, everything from driving to and from college along Kelly Parkway to everything else. So it's a great honor for me to be here. As was mentioned, I've had a long career now dealing with U.S. foreign policy and national security policy, 25 years in the government, another 10 plus years in private sector, consulting, speaking, think tanks, and so forth. And I've spent a particular amount of time in the last 6 years, dealing with Ukraine. I was appointed the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations in 2017 and did that for 2 years. And then when I stepped down from that position, I've done a number of other things to engage with Ukraine and support them, including helping to co-found the American University in Kyiv, which we opened last year under the full presence of Russia's invasion. We have our first graduation of students who entered mid-program this coming February. So I hope to be back in Kyiv again in February, my fifth trip since Russia's full-scale invasion, to be there for the graduation. I've been involved in a number of other ways in trying to help frame thinking about this. What I thought I would do this evening is give all of you a bit of an update with some perspective on the state of play of Russia's war against Ukraine, then try to draw a few longer-term challenges and consequences and conclusions about what all of this means. Talk a little bit about the United States, because that's where I'm coming from, and I think there are some challenges that we're facing in the United States, and in particular with how we deal with a challenge like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then wrap up with a few longer-term thoughts. So first off, on the state of play. It is easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day news. So now there's a Zelensky interview with Time magazine. There's a Zaluzhny article in The Economist. People are talking about a positional war. What does that mean? Will the U.S. provide longer range artillery systems or not? It's very easy to get bogged down in that. So even when we're talking about the state of play, I think we need to say that we are now well over 18 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine has survived as a sovereign, independent European democracy. Half of the territory that Russia took in the first days of the war, Ukraine has taken back. The remaining half is more difficult to take back, but Russia has lost tremendous numbers of equipment and personnel in seeking to just hold on to what they have taken in those early days of the war and still maintain. Ukraine has also suffered significant casualties, but at least Ukraine has allies that are capable, that are helping them. Russia has now become dependent on Iran and North Korea for drones and for artillery systems. They're seeking to rebuild their military industrial supply capacity. It is going very slowly. They are making improvements, but it's going slowly. The West is also seeking to rebuild its defense industrial capability and accelerate our ability to provide support to Ukraine. That's also going very slowly. Ukraine has several advantages in the conflict. Ukraine has the single greatest advantage, which is the fact that they are defending their home. These are their lives, their families, their relatives, their farms, their villages. They know they have no choice but to fight and defend their country. This is something that, frankly, Russia does not have. Its forces are there as an expeditionary force, many of them only for the money, a lack of morale, very poor leadership, very poor command and control, very poor results, very poor conditions for the Russian soldiers. Another advantage that Ukraine has is its ability to strike at longer range with precision based on the Western equipment that's been given to Ukraine. Russia has more numbers of personnel, more numbers of systems, more numbers of artillery shells, but without the precision, without, therefore, the impact. Both sides have had to change tactics recently. For much of the summer and early fall, we were talking about Ukraine launching a counteroffensive in order to retake territory that Russia had taken previously. They had minor success. Few areas moving particularly towards a key logistics hub in the south that gives them a little bit better positioning to take out Russia's supply chains. But overall, only minor success. Now that the forces have exhausted themselves a bit, the weather has changed, both sides have changed tactics a bit. The Russians have mostly reverted to doing what they were doing last winter, bombing Ukrainian cities, trying to take out Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, particularly the energy grid, and having one big push on the front line, this time around the city of Avdiivka. Ukraine has largely stopped trying to retake significant amounts of territory in the south, where it had been doing so earlier this year, and is focused again on longer range precision-guided attacks against Russia's military logistics infrastructure, and supporting more partisan activity and special forces activity in Russian-occupied areas. Unfortunately, it looks like this situation is what we're going to see for the next several months of the winter. I don't think we're going to see a significant change in this in either direction. Every night, Russia launches airstrikes against Ukrainian cities. These are mainly Iranian-made drones and Russian missiles, but fewer and fewer in number as they're trying to conserve them. The Ukrainians have drastically improved their air defenses compared to where we were last year. They enter this winter better prepared for this sort of attack than they were last year. It will still result in lots of civilian casualties. It will still result in continued warfare, and it will easily go into next spring, next summer, and this war will continue. So that is the sad state of play on the front line. But let's stop for a moment and think, what does this mean? So even taking a realistic assessment such as that, what does this mean? The most important thing, the number one thing to take away from this, is that Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. They're fighting to regain their territory. Russia's fighting against them to take even more territory, but Ukraine survives. And this is made clear by a number of steps that have been decided and taken already, such as last week, the European Union deciding to open accession talks with Ukraine for Ukraine's EU membership. This is more than just candidate status as it was for the past year. This is a real commitment on the part of the European Union that they see Ukraine as a part of a European family. We had the NATO summit in July last year in Vilnius, where NATO again reiterated that in the long run, Ukraine will also be a member of NATO. So that will provide a security blanket for Ukraine as an EU member. We're seeing long-term decisions being taken, such as the Europeans' decision for a 5-year period to provide financial support to Ukraine's state budget. This is critical because the economy in Ukraine has taken a big hit in GDP as a result of Russia's attacks, and that means tax revenue is down, and yet the demands on the state budget are the same, if not even higher. And that budgetary support from the European Union is critical, and they've made a long-term commitment to that. The United States has also made a commitment to Ukraine's budget, provided through the World Bank, and that is likely to continue, and I'll come back to that. We've also made some long-term decisions on military support. The U.S. is now going to vote on a package of $60 billion of military assistance to cover all of next year. We'll talk about the House of Representatives, and this is going to be a difficult vote, but I'm optimistic about it. We've also seen the U.S. and other NATO countries decide to give their F-16 aircraft to Ukraine, along with the maintenance and the training and the pilots and the logistical supply chain that goes with that. That is not a simple, short-term decision. It's not just a piece of equipment. This is a program. We've seen Ukraine successfully resume international shipping in the Black Sea out of its western Black Sea ports. I just read that the American ambassador in Kyiv, Bridget Brink, a friend of mine, and just made the announcement yesterday that over 100 ships have now gone through this independent sea route, independent of any kind of Russian stranglehold through a grain deal. That now seems to be a thing of the past, and Ukraine is resuming shipping and freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. So all of these things are important because they point to a long term of Ukraine's future. We can also draw some conclusions about Russia and Russia's future. Russia's brazen aggression against Ukraine, Putin's explicit claims that he is rebuilding the Russian Empire, comparing himself to Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, denying the existence of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukraine as a separate national identity. These are the hallmarks of a fascist or genocidal ideology. And this is something that is unacceptable in Europe today. As all of you know, Europe has been through this. It was the worst set of wars, the worst time in European history. And now we see that this is threatening a comeback. And that is unacceptable for peace and security in Europe overall. Russia has put itself under Putin on the wrong side of this. And there is no way of going back to business as usual with Russia when that is the policy and the ideology, when there are such severe sanctions in place, when the leader of the country is under indictment from the International Criminal Court for war crimes because of the abduction and indoctrination of children. There's no going back to normal with Russia like that. And you see that and you hear that all throughout European capitals. Another longer-term consequence that we see is the West has actually become more united again. We go through our ups and downs of the US and Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe. We go through our ups and downs of whether we are fighting with each other or whether we are actually working in common purpose. And I think because of Russia's war against Ukraine, it has not only weakened Russia and strengthened Ukraine, it has strengthened a transatlantic Western democratic community. And I think that will be a lasting impact again. I mentioned the Black Sea, but I think there is now a growing awareness that the Black Sea itself is a region that deserves attention. You know, we've thought of this before as the Western Med, we've thought of this as the Baltic Sea, we've thought of this during World War II, the North Atlantic. No one in the West has really ever thought about the Black Sea as a region deserving of attention in its own right. But when you think about it, you have Russia, which has a legal claim to 10% of the coastline, and yet seeks to dominate all shipping in the Black Sea and has threatened freedom of navigation, has threatened attacks on internationally flagged vessels in international waters, and occasionally carried out such attacks in order to try to deter those shippers from continuing shipping. This has caught the attention of, I think, a wider community in the world that there needs to be freedom of navigation, there needs to be safety of shipping, particularly for third-party foreign flag carriers just going about business, that there are many states that border the Black Sea. 3 of them are NATO allies, 2 of them are NATO partners, 1 of them is Russia. So there's a lot of other interest here, and it is an interest mainly about building better governed, less corrupt democratic societies, stronger economies, economies that are integrating with the global marketplace and doing so with a sense of security. And that's a vision for the Black Sea region that I don't think people have talked about before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February last year, not with any seriousness of purpose. Another long-term consequence here is we have rediscovered, and I mentioned this earlier, but we've rediscovered the importance of standing up against these isms, whether it's fascism, imperialism, these ideologies that dictatorships have the luxury of adopting and acting on. Democracies will quickly throw out their leaders if they go crazy and put in a new one. But in dictatorships, they have the luxury of adopting these ideologies which become very dangerous for everybody. And I think that's the reason why the US and Europe have reacted so strongly in the end of the day, because you could make an argument, and many people do in the United States, to be clear, you could make an argument that Ukraine's far away, Ukraine's not our concern, it used to be part of the Soviet Union, they're fighting it out, you know, why does this involve us? And the reason is because if an ideology like that, to deny the existence of another people, their language, their culture, their history, and so forth, is allowed to succeed, and if an imperial purpose of building an empire on the backs of other people and their countries and their lives, if that's allowed to succeed, then it won't stop just with Ukraine. The extent of the Russian Empire was far greater than just Ukraine. The extent of the Soviet Union was far greater than just Ukraine. And a lot of countries are looking at this with great trepidation, that if this ideology and aggression by President Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, it will continue elsewhere, and then we will have an even bigger burden, an even greater responsibility to stop it elsewhere. So that is a challenge that we face, and a long-term consequence that we know we have to stand up to this. Now, I mentioned the US, and I want to drill in on that a little bit now, because this is a very fraught debate within the United States. You have a White House, President Biden, US administration, that, to be fair, has, I think, been the key to helping save Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state. Without the quick and vast provision of military supplies and training to Ukraine, they wouldn't have had what it needed to defend themselves against Russia. But we got it there, and they succeeded at defending themselves. Many of us would argue that we could have done it faster, we could have done it more decisively, and we could have done it with greater impact, particularly last fall, before Russia had the opportunity to build these very deep defensive lines in southern and eastern Ukraine, the trenches, the tank traps, and so on. We could have done more last fall, and we didn't. So we did a lot, but we didn't do enough. That has led to a situation where people in the United States, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, in the House of Representatives, are saying, okay, so how much more, and for how long? And what is your strategy here? How is this going to be different than what we've seen for the last year and a half? And so far, I have still not heard anyone give a credible answer to that question. I think it is a fair question, and this is the question that House Republicans are asking. I know the consequences of not doing it, and I've just talked about those, and I think they would be terrible for the United States. I think it's a U.S. interest to make sure that Ukraine succeeds, but we need to do a better job of articulating the goal and the means to achieving the goal, and then putting the resources against it to accomplish that. All of that being said, we have a majority of people in the United States, when you take public opinion surveys, who support Ukraine and want the United States to help Ukraine defend itself. We have a majority of Republicans taking that position in the general public, an even greater majority of Democrats. In the United States Senate, the minority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, has been one of the most outspoken leaders supporting Ukraine. Every time the White House put a bill to provide aid to Ukraine to the Congress, Senator McConnell amended it to increase the amount, not thinking that it was enough. That has just happened again, although he's not taking credit for it. But the original request was $24 billion from the White House. Now it's $60 billion. He, I think, encapsulates the traditional national security-minded and long-term security-minded view of the majority of Republican voters and Republican members of the House and Senate. There is a very small minority of far-right Republicans, principally in the House of Representatives, who, because of the numbers, have a high degree of influence over the Speaker of the House. Because the Republican majority is only a majority of 5, there's about 17 far-right members, and if they decide not to vote with the Republican Party, it becomes a crisis for the Republican Party's ability to get anything through in the House of Representatives. But if you were to take an up or down vote on aid to Ukraine in the House of Representatives, even today, where it's just brought to the floor and everyone gets to vote how they wish, you'll have 350 votes easily in favor of aid to Ukraine and probably 70 some against. So the challenge for the Speaker is to figure out how does he bring it to a vote on the floor without being trapped by this small minority on the far right and without losing his speakership. That's what politics is for. I used to work for George Robertson, who, as defense minister of the UK, I worked for him as Secretary General of NATO, but when he was defense minister, he said, look, if you can't ride 2 horses at the same time, what are you doing in this circus? And I think that is the way to think about what Speaker McCarthy is going through in the House right now. Yes, it's very, very difficult, but that's why he's there. And it probably can be done. Now, what's interesting is that we've seen a separation of issues in the House of Representatives between the general U.S. budget, where there is a very fraught debate, and supplemental support for Israel and Ukraine. The administration, with the support of the Senate, has put forward a proposal to support Israel and Ukraine into the same piece of legislation. Speaker McCarthy had the Congress vote on a piece of aid only for Israel, which passed. That piece of legislation will never make it to the floor in the Senate. Meanwhile, the Senate has passed the overall package, including Ukraine and Israel. That will come up on the floor in the House, probably after they deal with the continuing resolution this weekend. And when it does come up to the floor as a clean up or down vote on that, you'll have 350 votes in favor. So I am fairly optimistic that the United States continues its support for Ukraine through this fall and with a sufficient amount of resources to cover all of next year's presidential election. And that gets us to the point of the presidential election. We have a President Biden who has been very forthright and outspoken in his support for Ukraine and Israel. We have a President Trump who has differentiated between Israel, full support, and Ukraine, not so. But he's not boxed himself in. He hasn't said what he would or wouldn't do. All he has said is that if he was president, he would end the war in a day, but never describing how. That to me sounds just like political posturing in an election and figuring out what to do for real later if he actually gets elected. And then there's one other factor here, which is that Trump has to win the Republican primaries in order to be the opponent of President Biden in the upcoming election. And he looks like he's in a very strong position today. He's polling around 50% in Republican primaries. But we are beginning to see, after 3 presidential debates and a 4th one coming up in December, the consolidation of the post-Trump vote in the Republican Party. I wouldn't call it the anti-Trump vote, because I don't think anyone wants to split the party or alienate Trump voters. I think what they want is to try to move on, that we need to have a new generation of leadership without all the baggage, leadership that can perhaps unite the party rather than divide it. And I think that's beginning to consolidate. A few candidates have dropped out recently, former Vice President Pence, Senator Tim Scott. A few others are polling around 0 and will probably drop out either before or either after, but even possibly before the next presidential debate in December. And I think the person who emerges as the obvious post-Trump candidate is former Governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, whom I had the privilege of meeting yesterday. And I think that presents an opportunity for Republican voters to see a choice. I would still say, to be realistic, Trump has a capture on the imagination of a large chunk of the Republican Party right now, but in politics, anything can change, so it's still competitive. Now, the final thing I wanted to say, coming back to some longer-term implications, and I hope I've spoken for about the right length of time here. I don't want to shortchange you, and I don't want to bore you. But I think the final thing I want to say is that we are in a period of time now where we have to go back and remember some fundamental things. All of human history, really, has been about the nature of governance. Do people get to choose and change their leaders and thereby have democratic systems with renewal and the ability to change course? And those people are treated as citizens who have a say over the government? Or do you have small groups of people who exercise power over others, and their principal purpose in doing so is to expand their power? So you have this authoritarian model that treats people as subjects versus a democratic model that treats people as citizens. And we've seen a period of time where the authoritarians have started to make a comeback. And it's no coincidence that Iran and Russia are working together, with Iran supplying the drones for Ukraine, for Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia just backing off as Iran authorizes Hamas to launch major attacks on Israel, hosting in Moscow Hamas and Hezbollah, really a first time for Moscow, really breaking with Israel for a first time. Israel's tried always to have a balance in its relations with Russia and relations with others. Russia has really broken that now. There's a reason why Ukraine is supporting Israel now, and vice versa, although less so Israel toward Ukraine at the moment. There's a reason why Taiwan wants to see Ukraine succeed in defending itself against Russia. Because if Ukraine fails, it's an encouragement to Beijing that the West won't be able to help Taiwan survive either. So all of these things are bubbling back up to the surface, and they are all a contest really over values, really over the nature of government. Do people get to choose their own leadership and maintain it, or does a small group impose on it and then seek to expand their rule? And that's exactly what we're seeing with Iran in the Middle East, with China in East Asia, with Russia and Ukraine and potentially elsewhere in Europe, not to mention their ongoing occupation of 20% of Georgia and part of Moldova. So as citizens who benefit from a Western, democratic, law-abiding, market-driven, secure space in the world, I think it's a reminder to us that we have a stake in the way these battles come out, because that's what makes our world safe. If it fails in these places, we will have a much harder time ahead. And if these countries or territories succeed, then it'll be a better world for our societies as well. So we have a stake in this. And I think that that is something that we've taken for granted for a long time, that we don't have to do hard things. But we're at that stage again where we do have to do some hard things. Thank you all very much for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think we have question and answer.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the first question.
Okay.
Could you tell us if the West will make the right decision, political decision? Could we deliver quickly the right weapons for Ukraine to win? Or do we have some bottlenecks, problems on the European and American industries?
Well, I think the way I would describe it is that the West has done enough, but not enough. So it has been just enough, just in time, so that Ukraine is clearly surviving as a European state. But we could have done it faster and better. Why do we not do it faster and better? There is a desire to avoid escalation into a direct conflict with Russia. I think the White House is gripped with that worry. They do not want to take a step that would be that they would perceive as Putin perceiving that it would be an escalation that would lead to direct conflict. Putin is very adept at working that psychological game. By threatening the use of nuclear weapons or talking about the use of nuclear weapons. He is sending a signal to try to influence thinking in the West to cause us not to do certain things. The argument against this has grown stronger as this war has dragged on. And the White House itself has been dragged into decisions every step of the way. And I can go through a long list of things the White House said no to first, and then later said yes to. Stinger missiles, HIMARS, Abrams tanks, F-16s, long-range artillery, and so forth. And then we finally did all those things anyway. I think we are getting to a point, ironically perhaps, because of the resistance in the House of Representatives from some Republicans, for a more focused and assertive policy coming out of the administration. There's a demand for that coming from the House in order to justify the continued support. So I think we will improve. The key things that we have not yet done that I think should be done and are on the table are the longest range ATACMS missiles, which can go all the way to Russian supply depots that in Ukraine, in occupied territory in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians cannot now reach. I think that's number one. I think more support on the naval side to the Ukrainians so that they can fully and confidently reopen their shipping in the Black Sea, which would be vital for their economy. And one thing we are doing, but we just need to keep doing, is improving and improving and improving Ukraine's air defense capability, which will be improved by the delivery of F-16s next summer, and they're becoming operational. But we have to be thinking further ahead about air defense capability. I think that the most likely scenario will be that we achieve all of this with hesitation, with hiccups, with slowness, but I think we will achieve that. The European Union has done a good job of identifying resources for subsidizing increased defense industrial production, particularly the ammunition, the types of shells that Ukraine needs. The US is behind the EU on this, but is starting to get there. And I think the way it's going to work with the US will be different from the EU, which is providing a fund. The US will guarantee procurement funds for ammunition produced through foreign military assistance. And then the companies will make the investment to increase their production capacity, knowing that there is an offtake. And I think that's probably the way it'll work in the US. But it's a very good question you asked, because we still have to push for this. We haven't done it right yet. And so we still have to stay focused.
Oui, puis-je poser ma question en français ou voulez-vous que je italic in English?
Vous pouvez poser en français. Si je ne comprends pas, je vais essayer de
I will translate.
distance.
Non, vous avez parlé avec brio et vu de l'intérieur de la démocratie états-unienne, et il y a quelque chose qui, moi, m'interpelle beaucoup, c'est l'influence qu'ont pu avoir Poutine et la Russie sur les élections états-uniennes, comme sur le Brexit, et on le sait un peu dans toutes les démocraties. Ils ont aujourd'hui des moyens électroniques, enfin des fermes de trolls, enfin tous les moyens qui ont pu être utilisés pour intervenir. C'est ce qu'ils avaient fait aussi au début, en 2014, quand ils ont envahi l'Est de l'Ukraine. Donc j'aimerais avoir votre avis, vu de l'intérieur des États-Unis, sur quelle est la conscience de la société des États-Unis sur cette ingérence et sur ces manipulations qui, on le voit, sont énormes. Enfin, pour un observateur vu d'Europe, c'est très important. It's all right?
Okay, no, I think I got it. Thank you.
You get it,
So
okay.
the question, as I understood it, is, are people in the US fully aware of the degree to which Russia tries to manipulate elections using various types of means, electronic, social media, and so forth? And implicitly, what are we doing about that? It's a very interesting question. The first thing I would say about Russia's interference in US elections, probably in Europe as well, but speaking about the United States, they don't convince people to believe things that they don't already believe. They just amplify it. And that seems to be the effective means of creating more chaos and creating more havoc. So we do have an issue independent of Russia, of our own political discourse, of our own adoption of conspiracy theories or wild accusations, or frankly, fair accusations that we then try to explain away with spin. And this is our own problem. What Russia then does is it takes threads from this, using bots, using messaging, using direct emails, amplifying and amplifying these divisions. And they're pretty good at that. But I don't believe that it's decisive, at least not yet. I don't think we can point to any election in the US that was decided because of these Russian things. I think they have always been decided based on where the heart of the American public is at the time. So I think that there is an awareness. I'm not sure it's decisive. Doing something about it is incredibly difficult because the first efforts at this have become themselves incredibly controversial. Trying to identify what is fake news, identify what is disinformation, and then trying to prohibit that or block that, including the US government going to social media channels like Facebook to say, you have to take these things down because this is fake news, which has then been attacked from the civil liberties side and the far right as well, as saying this is a government exercise to curtail free speech in a way that if the government did it would be unconstitutional, but they're influencing social media companies to do it for them because they want to limit that free speech. So this has proven to be highly controversial and very difficult to deal with. I think the best anecdote, frankly, to dealing with this sort of Russian propaganda, if you can get algorithms that social media and other websites, comment boxes and newspaper columns use that identify bots, and that's reliable that they're not people, but they're bots, okay, I think that's one good step that we could take and do a better job at that. But the other thing is to actually have our own positive messaging out better. I think that we have had the most prominent public messaging from both sides of the aisle in the US, reinforcing some of these narratives that then the Russians pile onto. We really need people to be more civil, more centrist, more reasonable, more problem-solving, more articulate. And we haven't had the kind of leaders able to break through and get that kind of message across, at least not for a long time. I mentioned I saw Nikki Haley yesterday, and she said, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you know which way is up. And I think that we may be at that point, and maybe we will find a way where some of our leaders start really to focus on what it is we want to say rather than the blaming instead.
Il s'agira de la dernière question.
Good evening. Thank you for being with us. Two questions that are somewhat related. With President Zelensky, I think we were all very surprised and impressed by his leadership, especially because he was someone who was perhaps least prepared to be in the position that he was in, and has successfully led his country. And I wonder, what is your evaluation of his leadership right now, and how much further he can carry on, because I can imagine he's quite tired at this point. And then related to that, at the end of this conflict, whenever that is, Ukraine will be left with one of the most well-equipped, well-trained, battle-hardened army in Europe. And what are the consequences of that?
Yes.
Thank you.
So on your last point, I like to joke that Ukraine having the largest, most battle-hardened, best-equipped military in Europe, it would be dangerous not to have them in NATO. But seriously, I think that they make a contribution to European security. And this is a fundamental point that I should bring up. People have tended, before 2022, to look at Ukraine as a burden and a problem. Corrupt, economically backward, no clear rule of law. Then from 2022 through much of the last year, they've tended to look at it as a charity case. The poor Ukrainians, they're being attacked, they need our help. And so that's been the mentality. But I honestly think that we need to adopt a mentality that if we want to get to a place where there is a prosperous, democratic, secure, and stable Europe, and one that has great supplies of renewable energy and is building the Europe of the future, I think that Ukraine is not a charity case. Ukraine is part of the solution. You need to have the Ukrainian military capabilities and trained people. You need to have Ukrainian energy resources. You need the vibrancy and dynamism and talent of Ukrainian youth. And you need Ukrainian agriculture. And this will make Europe better, stronger, safer with Ukraine in it. And the same set of NATO as well. So I think we have to look at Ukraine not as the problem, but actually as a potential solution for a lot of the things that we care about. As for President Zelensky, I met him first in February of 2019, before he was elected president, and then I've met him several times since. The most striking thing about him when I met him in February 2019, striking to me, is that he came across as sincere. He came across as someone from outside of politics who wanted to change Ukraine. It reminded me of President Obama a little bit because he believed that he could be that agent of change. We're going to fundamentally transform everything in the country. It's been as he would have said at the time, a country dominated by corrupt politics and oligarchs and lack of transparency, and he wants to clean all of that up. So it doesn't mean that he was a good leader at the time. It doesn't mean that he was capable of doing that. And in fact, in his first year in office, you'll remember, his popularity plummeted from 70% to 20% on perceptions that he was ineffective. But he was sincere. He was trying to do this, and he wanted to do this. So when Ukraine was subject to a full-scale Russian attack in February of 2022, I at least was not surprised that he rose to the occasion, because he again was sincere that I'm the leader of Ukraine, I have to be the leader of our people in defending our country. And he immediately jumped into the role. It helps that he's a professional communicator as a business before getting into politics. But he understood what the Ukrainian people needed and expected of him, and he believed in doing it. Then it turns out that he was very good at this domestically in Ukraine, internationally, and I think he has proven to be the exact right leader at the right time for making Ukraine's case domestically and to the world and bringing Ukrainian people together. Imagine in a country that before 2014, Russia's first invasion, had a little bit of ambivalence about Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking relationship with Russia, to have a native Russian-speaking Jew who now exclusively speaks Ukrainian, leading Ukraine in defense against attacks by Russia. That really speaks volumes about what Ukraine is today and what kind of leader Vladimir Zelensky is. Now, going forward, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard. Ukraine has martial law at the moment. Ukraine has a centralized media environment at the moment. It would probably not be a good idea in the midst of this war for Ukraine to hold presidential or parliamentary elections on schedule next year. In Germany, there's a provision in the Constitution that prevents having elections under conditions of wartime. And I think in Ukraine, it could actually lead to divisions within the country. As people in politics, naturally, you have to compete against your opponent. So it's probably better to postpone that. If he did run next year, I'm sure he would win a vast majority, but it might be at the expense of greater divisions in the country. And I think we don't know exactly when or how this war will be settled down in some way. If Putin is defeated, if Ukraine is victorious, if it just settles again as it did in 2015 for a few years, we simply don't know. And I think when it does, and whatever that is, we're going to have to see an acceleration of reform and investment and economic growth in Ukraine. I would argue it needs to start today, and I've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half talking about investment in Ukraine and economic recovery in Ukraine. I think there are ways to do this that will be profitable for investors, that will be bringing resources to the country, creating tax revenue, and eventually making Ukraine more resilient so that it can better deal with this Russian invasion over time. But it's an uphill battle to convince people of that. But starting today, and especially as the war progresses, that will be the challenge for President Zelensky, is to get back onto that. How are we doing on time? I'm happy if we're happy to continue.
Alors, c'était la dernière question. Donc, je vais vous prier de rester assis un petit instant avant de vous inviter à prendre le cocktail au fond de la salle.
Very good.
Merci.
So I saw a woman here in the middle row, or did we have someone else lined up?
C'est terminé.
C'est terminé. So I thought you were saying let's have a dernière question. Okay, very good. Okay. Thank you all very, very much.
Si vous pouvez rester assis un petit instant, s'il vous plaît. If you can just sit down for a minute, please.